I have to get a haircut out at the Officers Club at 10:45. Can we make that all right?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
All right, this is a special oral history interview with Mr. Horace Lowers, being conducted on the 23rd day of February 2005 in the office of the command historian. Mr. Lowers, do we have your permission to videotape this?
Certainly.
Could you state for the record your full name?
Horace Robinson Lowers.
Okay, let's start off and tell us briefly about yourself before you came to Huntsville.
Okay. And I do have some notes of my own here that maybe help. Yeah, I was born in Oil City, Pennsylvania, 17 miles from the world's first oil well. I went to college at Clarkson College, now Clarkson University in upstate New York. Got a mechanical engineering degree. Was offered a job at Chrysler, which included the opportunity to get a master's degree in their technical institute. And so I did that. Then let's see, I went for 2 years as an instructor at mechanical engineering at Ohio State. And as I've said in some notes to myself, as my Army military supervisors gained confidence in me, I was given some rather responsible assignments. One was working with a Navy consultant from industry, George Fausch, who later became a Deputy Secretary of Defense, I think, or maybe the Army. He had developed in industry where he was headed up one of the companies, a system called line of balance, which let me predict what tank deliveries would be like at the end of the month without having to wait till the end of the month to find out that the information we'd been getting from the ordnance districts and the contractors was screwed up. That line of balance thing went into effect on a number of programs. And then I was moved to a position of special assistant in the industrial division of the Office Chief of Ordnance.
And what year was that?
Oh, that was about 1940, pardon me, 49, I was, it was about 1957 probably. And then I hadn't been there too long when, much to my surprise, I was offered the opportunity to go to the Industrial College of the Armed Forces as one of 2 Army civilians. And shortly after I got through with that, I was offered the GS-17 position of Deputy Chief Industrial Division Army Ballistic Missile Agency, here, of course, in Huntsville. And I accepted in the spring of '59. And of course, I worked with the von Braun team not very long before they went off on their own, but it was educational, and particularly in the area of reliability, as their successful rocket firings demonstrated. They understood reliability and understood it well, a lesson some of us had to learn. So then when NASA was formed and the missile activities of the Army were combined in the Army Ordnance Missile Command for a very short while. I was dubbed Chief Engineer there and then became Chief Engineer at the Army Missile on 23 May '62. And I served then until I retired in February, I think, 1980. So I've served as the first and last, it may turn out, first and last Chief Engineer at Missile Command.
When you first got to Huntsville, what were your impressions of the area?
I had a lieutenant colonel that I knew up in Washington that had been down here, and when he heard I was coming, he said, "I'd like to come out and talk to you one night." And so he came out to the house for dinner, and he started to give me a rundown, both on the personalities that were here, and he was very good at that. As it turned out, he had them pretty well. but he scared my wife to death. She was an avid bridge player, and he said, you can't buy bridge tokens or whatever they use to keep track. He said, you have to go to Birmingham or Atlanta to buy those. And he said the principals in the schools sell pencils outside their office to try to make a living. Oh boy, he had her almost canceled out before we got here. Fortunately, it didn't turn out to be that bad.
What about Redstone when you first got here?
Well, of course, I got busy as soon as I got here. I could see a few things that I thought needed to be done, and we can get into a couple of those if you like.
Sure.
But, well, I was impressed with it. One thing I was impressed with, being a new organization, both ABMA and then the Missile Command, we pretty much had the pick of talent. And I think we had probably the highest level of civilian employees of any of the commands, partly because we were the newest. The others had people that had maybe worked for a while, then went in service during the 40s, and then came back out, and worked, and they were kind of out of touch with things. And I just think we had the highest level bunch of people I've ever had to deal with.
I want to go back just real quickly when Mike asked you the question about what you thought about Huntsville. You talked about the bridge tokens. 59 was a bad time to come down because there was no housing anywhere. So where did you all live?
We were lucky. There was a little development, small development going in Blossomwich, which I was told was a good place to go because they probably had the best elementary school in town. And I had some adopted kids at that point. And so we were lucky to get a house just as it was being finished.
Wow.
And moved in and lived there for a number of years before we decided to build a house.
So you were the exception, not the rule. I mean,
I guess I probably was. I know some of the people that I worked with and that worked for me. I know they were all pretty well housed down, bedded down, but they were ahead of me getting here. Ron Gober was one of them.
When we talked to Ernie Young, he and his wife lived in a little one-room apartment over a pharmacy off of California. So you heard stories like that.
Yeah, but I never had that problem.
That was good. Okay.
Did you have, when you were here, because Medeiros was still here as
Yes.
commander, do you have any remembrances of him?
Well, I knew Medeiros in Washington. You see, he was chief of industrial division in Washington while I was in the tank automotive branch there. So I knew him. My impression was that he didn't like working with civilians very much. He much preferred to work with the military. He was a sharp guy, no question about it. And I remember we had a tire testing program going with the Bureau of Standards to see how we could buy the best tires. And we had a track, in toward track, where we'd run the tires around. And the Bureau of Standards was doing that for us. And we reached a point where we were going to review that program, and he called me, and I guess because my boss wasn't there, and said, I want you to cancel out that program. And I said, General, I've already made up my mind I want to cancel it out, so you and I are in agreement.
What about Toftoy? Did you ever?
No, I never had any dealings with Toftoy.
So you're here in the early 60s, and we stand up the Missile Command, and General McMorrow's commander.
McMorrow, I knew him in Washington. He was deputy chief of industrial division before I came down here, so I knew him fairly well.
What was he like?
Well, I thought I liked him. I never had any real intimate connections with him till we came down here, and I took him water skiing once. But I liked him. He was perhaps not the most personable guy that I've ever met, but I thought he was efficient, knew what he was doing.
It's interesting because, I mean, there's not too many people we've talked to who really knew
They
him.
really knew him.
I mean, that's a black hole in our history that we're trying to fill in.
What
Uh-huh.
about Schomburg?
I didn't know Schomburg very well either. Of course, he was here just a short while.
Yeah.
Yeah.
When General McMorrow died, do you remember anything about, was there any, like, special, I guess they had the memorial service or something?
I have to say I don't remember it. I'm not sure he was on duty here when he died. I don't believe he was.
Yeah,
He was?
he's the only commander to die in office.
That's funny. I didn't remember that.
I mean, he died August of
I-
'63.
Okay, I knew he died, but I didn't remember that he'd left his job. I knew he was sick.
Let's go through some others and we'll come back to something. How about, you mentioned to us earlier when we were talking, Zert and Charlie Eifler.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a little more about what it was like working for them?
Zert pretty much left me up to make my own judgment of what I want to do. I can hardly remember him ever making a suggestion to me. Charlie Eifler was just the other way around. He was the most technically proficient of any of the CGs that I got to know. And he could give me more things to do than I could think of. And I didn't mind that. You know, his mind and mine were somewhat in the same track. So I really enjoyed working for Charlie Eifler. I know he scared people to death. John McDaniel hated to have to go in to talk to him, but
What was it because he was just so short that he scared people? He was just like, oh.
no, I think he was just very well technically trained. I don't know that I know what his training was, but I assume he was West Point.
You mentioned John McDaniel. Can you tell us a little more about him?
You could spend all day telling stories about John McDaniel. I'd have to say he was efficient. He was politically savvy, very politically savvy. I remember going up to Raytheon with he and you mentioned his son earlier, and he brought his son along. We had a meeting with some kind with the Raytheon people, and he just wanted his son to make sure he knew some of the people that were involved, and that was kind of typical of John.
He said we've heard that he liked to manage by conflict. That's what several people have told us.
Well, of course, I was never in his organization until he was the deputy in Moradcom, so I was involved with him a short while. He made a decision regarding something in our testing program, and he made the decision he wasn't going to have us do it. He was going to farm it out or such thing like that. And Bob Black, who you won't have talked to, but Bob was a very savvy guy, still alive. He came to me and he said, "Horace, you know, that's a terrible thing." And I said, "Yeah, I agree." And so the first opportunity I got, I went to John. And I said, "John, I don't think you ought to do that." He said, "Well, I'm not going to." He said, "I'm just trying to stir things up a little bit." So,
I want to back up just for a second. When you say the job of chief engineer, what did that consist of back then? You were responsible for what?
no, John wasn't chief
No,
engineer.
I'm talking about you.
Oh,
You said you were the first chief engineer.
I was the first one at MyCom, yeah.
So what is a chief engineer?
Chief engineer pretty well did anything he wanted to. You see, we had a big R&D organization under John McDaniel, and we had nobody really paying attention to the engineering aspects of the thing. To give you an example, I realized shortly after I got here that missile systems had corrosion problems. Now that's an engineering issue, you know, and I had taken a graduate course in corrosion when I was teaching at Ohio State. So I said, the first thing we need to do is get on top of this, because we had Ajax missiles sitting down on the beach in Florida, and in 56 days they'd corroded to the point where they were useless. And there was one guy up in Rock Island, and I wish I could remember his name, but he was he understood the corrosion problems, and he had the license apparently to put samples of corrosion in his car and go around and give people talks on why they ought to pay more attention to corrosions. So I got him lined up, and we put on a corrosion seminar. We had him train over, I've got the figures here somewhere, well over 200 people in the industries we were working with, engineers, and of course educating our people too. And we put out a directive on it, and I gave a paper to the Society of Automotive Engineers on our program. But that's the sort of thing I could do, you see. And it wasn't of any particular interest to John McDaniel. He was interested in developing things. So we never had any conflicts.
Right.
When it came to reliability, was everybody's ball game. And I was able to get away from the business of having just an inspection organization, but to have an organization that understood reliability and could make sure that we were using the latest tools to accomplish the things that we think product assurance ought to stand for.
So you were involved in programs like zero defects?
Zero defects day.
Ah.
Yeah, I sure was. Yeah, I was master of ceremonies. We had 9,000 employees out to celebrate to hear about zero defects at the football field. And we had Coach Bear Bryant. We had Tom Willey, who was the head of Martin Orlando, where the idea came from. And we had Roger Donlin, who was I think the only gold medal winner, Medal of Honor winner in Vietnam. And I mentioned Bear Bryant. And of course, I guess that's about it.
When was this? What?
15 September 65.
Well, tell us.
And then we were asked to follow that thought a little. That came out of our Pershing programs. The idea came from the guy who was in charge of Pershing at Martin Orlando, and we picked it up from him. Well, we didn't invent it, but it just seemed like such a good idea that we took off with it, and then we put out a program. We even had little badges we gave people if they'd sign a pledge to try to do an error-free job. And the Defense Department got interested in it and asked us to put on 2 defense seminars, one out in San Diego at the Navy training base there, and the other one in Washington. And so we got some fairly high-level military people at both of those. We had an old C-54 at that time, and we loaded that up with some of our folks and went out there and put the show on for them. So yeah, it ran, those motivational things never last. But I'd say we got a good 2 years of publicity out of it, and the concept was good.
So what did Bear Bryant say?
Well, he just basically said, you don't make mistakes if you want to win football games. That was his thesis.
Didn't it upset all the Auburn graduates who were there, having Bear Bryant down there?
And I didn't hear anybody bother that was concerned about it. I think everybody was glad to hear him.
What were some of the other challenges that you faced during your career at Redstone?
Okay, let me just kind of look here in just a minute. Well, I told you that I got involved in some of the tank problems. In fact, at one Christmas, I was asked by Major General Guthrie, through my boss, of course, in the 1970s, to put together a review team and go out and find out why Hughes couldn't deliver acceptable main battle tank night vision devices. And fortunately, I knew where the good guys were, and I never had anybody turn me down when I wanted to tap somebody for a task force or something like that. And so we went out to California and we got them unscrewed, and I got a real nice letter from General Guthrie. Said, particularly appreciated you giving up part of your Christmas holidays to get us out of trouble. But I did a fair amount of that, and you may know, I think you talked to Bob Whitley. Bob and I were on the source selection for the main battle tank. And I had about 30 engineers from all over the Army on my team looking at the engineering aspects, and Bob was looking at the management end of it. And it turned out to be much more than we expected. I think we spent 3 months in Detroit, and we'd get home every other weekend. And then the found that the Deputy Secretary of Defense pulled the rug out from under the Secretary of the Army. He had made a deal with the Germans that the Army knew nothing about. He said if the Germans will use the gas turbine engine, which was a new development at Chrysler, then we'll use their 120 millimeter cannon in their gunner's sight. Well, it turned out you couldn't use the gunner's sight because you'd have had to elevate them higher than this to get them in the tank. But we had to go back and reevaluate the two proposals again. It was, I was told the Secretary of the Army almost resigned over that. He wasn't at all happy, and we weren't either, of course. We thought we'd put enough time into it, and of course the answer came out different the second time. General Motors would have got the program.
Just to back up for a second, and I'm sure you explained this to Mike, but just to put it on record, the reason the chief engineer from MICOM was working on tanks was why?
Well, it was because the people like General Miley and General Guthrie and some of the others knew I'd been involved with tanks.
So it was just an unusual thing.
Yeah, that's what I said. I was an unusual chief engineer because I was spending a lot of time with non-missile things.
What, during your career, what accomplishments are you most proud of?
That's a tough question. Let me just look at my notes here a minute. Well, I think maybe forming what used to be called inspection and then used to become quality assurance, forming an organization that started at the beginning with reliability and worked right on up through. And I got John McDaniel's cooperation on that to form that kind of an organization, because nobody else in the Army or anywhere I know of in the military had one. And I think I would classify that as the thing that I thought was most difficult to accomplish, and yet was most effective once we got it. And that got me into a trip to Japan. I went over was invited over by the Japanese Management Association, and along with my director of quality, to talk to them in one of their plant management show, and then to study what they were doing in the business of quality and reliability, that sort of thing. And we discovered something apparently nobody else seemed to know in the United States. That was a professor by the name of Deming, forget his initials. He was with one of the colleges, and MacArthur had brought him over to Japan, and he taught them statistical quality control. And they took that very seriously. Our industry wasn't even into it yet. And so I think all in all, I think getting that picture of the Japanese being more progressive than we were got a lot of things going in U.S. industry. It took General Motors was the last to begin to understand what they needed to do. I would say generally that Japan, was destroyed, and when they were rebuilt, they got all new equipment. Our industry was suffering with very old equipment, and that was a big difference in what they could achieve and what we weren't achieving. And of course, eventually our industry got upgraded, but eventually they understood a little more about quality control than they thought they knew.
Was there any area that you didn't make the progress that you had hoped to make?
No, I don't think so. Something I started in Washington, this doesn't really answer your question, it just reminds me of it. Something I started in Washington because I learned about it from a Navy guy that I went to weekend duty with, that there was a thing called value analysis, and it was invented by General Electric Company. And basically it said, hey, before you design something and put it on and build it, you want to figure out what it's supposed to do and what's the least economic or the most economical way of doing it. And so I picked it up from there and talked to this was, I believe, Joe McMorrow was involved with this. And I said, this is something we ought to be doing. And so he said, well, go ahead. So I put out an industrial, I couldn't go speak for the chief ordnance, but we put out an industrial division memorandum asking all of our organizations to get into it. And then we put on a symposium shortly after I came down here. I brought all the commands in to talk about value engineering, or value engineering as we called it, value analysis as GE has called it. And we still have an organization here that's doing that, that's promoting that. So I'd say that's one of the long-lasting things that we did. It was, I think, was pretty effective.
Do you think we should rename our Value Engineering Award the Horace Lowers Award?
No, I didn't have anything to do with inventing it. I could, once in a while, could pick up an idea and steal it.
In all your years as chief engineer, there were a number of systems that came to fruition. Are there any that particularly stand out in your mind?
Well, I think the tow missile, and I know I got you guys involved with that. Yeah, I think the tow missile was a very successful program. And we had a couple of problems with it. I was involved looking at a couple of them where we would have lost the missiles if we hadn't corrected the problem. But I don't know whether the tow is still being built or not. It was just a couple of years ago. Yeah, of course it's modified now from what it was.
Yeah, just a few hundred times.
But I guess the Hellfire program turned out to be very successful. I guess it's still flying on the Apache. It had some problems getting going, although the Apache management was the worst. It took a long time to get them straightened out. But yeah.
What about the Pershing?
Oh, Pershing was a good program. I have to say it was effective from the word go. Now, I'll have to tell you that I don't know how many people remember this, but I got in when the Redstone program was pretty much running down, and the Jupiter program was alive because it was related to what NASA was doing. And but we were doing test firings every year or two or so to make sure that the ones that were in the field were still, there wasn't anything wrong with them. If you pulled them out and fired them, they'd still go. We found out looking at the data from some of those firings that we didn't have a long-range Pershing or long-range Redstone missile. It wouldn't do it at long range. And we had to go back to NASA, who had the range down there, and ask them if they'd be kind enough to do some firings for us so we could try to troubleshoot the problem. And we were lucky. You know, it could have been a serious problem, but we were lucky to find the problem and after a few firings and make sure we still had a good missile.
Just out of curiosity, you mentioned Von Braun earlier, and do you remember when he left in 1970?
Well, I didn't remember what date he left. Of course, I remembered when he left. And by the way, I did work for him on one aspect of it, and that was he had a source selection, chaired a source selection board for to pick the fourth stage for the Saturn missile, and I was asked to be on that source selection committee. I have to tell you, the politics in Washington beat him. The one we picked didn't win.
What do you think, we discussed this briefly earlier, I told you we'd be asking you, there's a very unique relationship, or so it seems, between the city, the community, and the Army at Redstone. Can you talk about that?
Well, of course, I was never in the Army here,
Or did you work for the Army?
but I worked for the Army. But I understand that everybody I've talked to, that Redstone was a choice place for once military knew what it was and where it was a choice place to be assigned. And I thought some awfully good people got assigned here.
And at the same time, the outside community were.
Oh, they recognized they had a gold mine and they went right after it to do anything they could to support it. I was served as president of the Army Ordnance Association 1 year here, so I got, you know, some of that military civilian flavor. But yeah, I think it's probably still, I would think still one of the choice places to go in the country. I hope it stays.
Do you remember, well, first of all, to the best of your knowledge, was there any event over all those years you were here that stood out that kind of epitomized the relationship between the installation? I understand you were a civilian working here.
Yeah.
But that epitomized the relationship between the installation and the Huntsville community? Like, did you ever go like for Armed Forces Days downtown or anything?
Well, yeah, I went a couple of times to the parades, but I can't think of any specific instance that I could use to illustrate what I think was a very close knit between the community and the arsenal.
Just out of curiosity, when Kennedy came here, he came here twice, once in '62 and once in early '63. Did you go out to any of those?
No, was not invited and didn't go. You know, they were you know how those things go. It's a show,
Well, I
and
mean,
quick show and tell, and
well, you know, Kennedy gave a speech at the airfield, and they had a bunch of people out there at the airfield. I mean, anybody who wanted to line up could.
oh, I guess so. I guess I was busy working.
What about, you mentioned you went to some of those armed forces things downtown. What were those like? The parades around?
Oh, I
the
was
square?
thinking, yeah, I was thinking of the parades. Yeah.
That's fine. Well,
And of course, while I was involved with the AOA, I, of course, was getting involved with some of their activities.
does a lot of people attend those parades in those days?
Oh, I think so. I think they were well attended.
Gosh, I had a question, I forgot. When the split, when MERCOM or ADCOM came into being, the time right before that was there a lot of turmoil out here?
I'm glad you brought that up. That was one of the stupidest things the Army ever did. And the guy that did it should have known better. He was a Martin Orlando executive before he wound up in the assistant secretary of the Army or something, and decided he could strengthen R&D by breaking it out from the rest of the activities. And I was just tickled to death that General Guthrie, when he came back to the command up in Washington, took a look at that and realized it and had the guts to say, we're not going to do that, you know. And that's of course about the time I got out. It was just after he'd made the decision to put it together, and that wasn't why I got out. I looked at what had happened as a result of that organization, and I had been heading up an engineering organization in the Moratcom, and I had about 400 employees in it, and I had test and I had quality and some other things. And so then when they put it back together, here's what turned out to be about a 200-person engineering organization. And I thought, what in the world am I going to do, contribute as a chief engineer when we got 200 engineering people, and the guy who was in charge then was a very capable guy, had his PhD, and a guy I had worked with and kind of brought up a little. And so I just thought it was just a good time to go. I talked to Lou Rockmiller about it, and he didn't seem to be bothered about it. I said, you know, I don't really think if I read the instructions that I could keep my, what did they call this? Service. I was a charter member of the executive service, I guess, or some such thing. I said, I don't really think I could keep that because I wouldn't have anybody I'm supervising. I said, I think it's just good time. He didn't seem to bother him, but I just made a rather quick decision and decided it was a good time to leave when I was ahead.
Did you, so growing up in Pennsylvania, you moved to Alabama, did you ever think you would be retiring here in this area? Or did you ever think about going anywhere else?
No, I can't think I think we were just tickled to death to be living here when I retired. I don't think I wouldn't have gone to live anywhere else in Alabama, I'll say that. I think Huntsville is unique in Alabama, and I just don't think I would have been fitted into the normal society in some of the other cities.
One of the things you brought up, and I just remembered, we were talking earlier about the formation of the Aviation Missile Command.
Yes.
And we were talking about you had worked a lot with the St. Louis group.
Well, I was on a, forgot for sure what we called it, but AMC decided they were going to do a review of programs in the Army, and it was headed up by a guy that had been a quality guy here and was working for Cy Lorber, who was the quality guy up in Washington, and he had Bob Whitley and I, we were both retired then, and had a guy, Link, from industry who was a good production, knew enough about production. And we were chartered to go around and review all of the Army's major programs. And we developed a scheme where we'd come in on a Monday morning and leave with a finished product on their desk Friday night. And it went over very well for a while. There was only one problem with it and the Army end of it, of the programs we reviewed and found things wrong with, they didn't know what to do about correcting them. So it got to be, after a while, it got to be a little frustrating. And the Apache was one where we went many times.
What do you see as the future of this area? You've been here a long time.
You mean just as an area?
The Huntsville community, Redstone Arsenal.
Well, I hope there's a future for both of them. I think Huntsville's You know, I haven't lived too many other places, but I've lived a few, and I think that I'm just as happy living here as I would be anywhere else. There's a lot to do. You can do anything you want to in Huntsville. You know, you say, well, golly, there's something wrong with the way we're treating children. Well, you can organize something and go after that. You can do almost anything you want to. And you can join almost any organization that appeals to you. So it's wide open to people who are interested in staying involved in something. If they're interested in retiring and playing bridge, it doesn't matter where you go, you know. But a lot of the people, and I'm finding at Carlton Cove, we've got some people who are still active and still interested in joining and doing things.
That's interesting. You mentioned Carlton Cove because there's a lot of, like, I think General Link is on the board.
Yes, he is.
But there's a lot of interaction. I mean, we're seeing more and more of these retirement communities being built around here, and I think that's going to be a big attraction in the future.
Yeah, I think both the two, Carlton and Redstone, I think are both having trouble filling up as fast as they thought they would. But that may change.
12? Yeah. Anything else, sir?
Well, I think you did well. You got no. I could mention a few other things that I've been involved in, but I think you probably got more than you need.
Yeah, what we'd like to do is probably just, if we could make a real quick copy of that.
Yeah, if, you may be able to follow it. What I did was just, I started some years ago doing a personal history just for my own edification and in case my kids someday when I'm gone want to know what the old man did when he went out the front door. So I have fairly well documented year by year the things that I thought were of significance. And so I was able to pull on that and put a little pitch together.
Is there anything else on that list that you want to mention?
Well, let me just run through here and see if there's anything you want to mention. I mentioned forming the Reliability Technical Committee, which then grew into a full-fledged quality organization.
I'm going to ask him about any dealings with Bill McCorkle.
About what?
Bill McCorkle?
Yeah.
What about him?
Well, I never had, shouldn't say never. I had contact with him, but never real close contact with him. He's a little bit different.
Are you surprised he's still working?
I remember years and years ago, he said the best time to retire from civilian life in the Army is the first opportunity you have. And yet he'll live till he's 115 probably if they'll let him.
Well, apparently he's never had an opportunity to retire. That's why he's still here.
Well, you always have an opportunity to
Well,
retire. All you got to do is write a retirement notice and say, I'm going.
I guess he doesn't have the time to write the retirement notice.
I just don't think he's interested in retiring. I think that's the whole story there.
I meant to ask you this. You retired in 1980. How many years of government service did you have when you retired?
Let's see, I started with the government in 1949, I think, and went till 80.
Okay, so you had 31 years, something like that.
Something like that.
And who did you go to work for?
Well, my first job was when I got, I worked for Chrysler in this program they had, which led up to a degree in automotive engineering.
After you retired.
Oh, after I retired.
Yes, sir.
Oh, I worked for Teledyne Brown on an unusual program where they were rebuilding military equipment for Israel, or for Egypt, and also developing a depot capability for them because the Russians had given them the equipment but hadn't given them any way to maintain it.
Yeah. So did you deal much with Mr. Moquin?
Not while I was working there. He was sitting up in the front office. I think I had one one session with him on something, and I don't remember. But I was working for a guy by the name of John White. And then I worked for SAI. Are you familiar with them? For a year. But I discovered what they wanted was somebody that would find jobs, find work for them. And I said, hell, I'm not going to do that, you know.
Well,
I'm not going to come out and knock on doors out here.
and that's apparently what a lot of these guys do. Is they get
Yeah,
hired
it's
to
a
go
it's a company. It's a employee-owned
Right.
company,
Right, I see.
and so they say if you're going to work here, you're part of the company. Go out and get business. And,
So who did you work for after that?
well, I got into this review thing for I don't know, maybe 3 years or so.
Really?
Yeah, and I think that was I believe that was all of my post-army work. I did some interesting things. I went down and taught some courses in South Africa for their Defense Department. Went down two years in a row and gave 1 week courses, but I gave 3 courses, 3 or 4 in all, and that was kind of interesting. Interesting place to be. Yeah.
Michael?
So is there anything else on your list you want to touch on?
Yeah, let's see here. Oh, one kind of an interesting job I had was another one of those tank things. There was a U.S. German agreement to develop a tank. Major General Colvin was the U.S. head of it, and don't remember if I knew who was head of the German end of it. And Colvin got hold of, and I think maybe he deserted at the time. It was January of '65. Asked if he could have me to put a little team together and go look at his end of the business, his military people and his industry people, and tell them how it ought to be organized to get the job done. And so the report got there was a procurement guy and another guy from AMC and me, and we looked at it and gave him a report, and it was approved by the CG of AMC, and I don't think I dared put in the report that I didn't think they would ever get that tank built. That there was nobody in charge of it, so how are you going to get anything done? And it got canceled. Let's see, I'm into 70s now. Oh, yeah, another tank problem. They had a problem. If you know anything about tanks, you probably know more than I do about them. They had a problem with the medium tank hang out a battery. Sometimes it'd fire once and get stuck. And the PM said, well, doesn't happen very often. We need to get those tanks to Europe, and Chrysler was anxious to get them over there. And a military review group said, we don't think we ought to ship them till we know we've got a good tank. And so I was asked to take a look at that along with Cy Lorber, who was the quality guy up in AMC, and we found out what the problem was. They just didn't realize that they had a warped recoil system on it due to some of the welding they'd done. And once they got that straightened out, I guess they were able to get the tank shipped. But I guess that's about it. I think that's all I did.
Well, that's a lot. Thank you, sir.